Welcome to Mark the Text again. My name's Dan. Thanks for watching these videos. As always, we're going to be looking at a text of Scripture today using some of the exegetical tools that come out of the National Training Events Strand 1. And so if you would like to see a video explaining each of those tools, there's a link in the top right of your screen now. You can click that for a short video explaining those different tools. Today, we're starting a new series because these videos line up with our Bible studies and talks in the Focus Ministry at Monash University. And we're going to be looking at the prophet Daniel. And today we're looking at Daniel chapter 1, which is there. So why don't you pause your video, have a look at Daniel 1 yourself, do some exegesis, and then come back and I'll show you a couple of things that I noticed. Well, wonder what you discovered. I thought, given that it's a new book, new series, noticing some of the obvious things that come up in the text might be helpful for us. In particular, some of the questions about who, the people, where, the places, when, the time, and that's going to help us think about why, the reasons as well. So back to the text here, Daniel chapter 1. First of all, some of these when questions. We've got in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And so that's definitely a when question going on there. And not everybody realizes this, but the Bible events are real events that took place in real human history. These were real people. These things really happened. And we know that the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is about 605 BC, before Christ came. And the passage ends with another when moment. We see that Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Whoops. So this is another when question. And this happened in 539 BC. 539 BC is when Cyrus, king of Persia, came to power. Now, what about the people? Some of these other questions are about the who. We've got this character Jehoiakim, king of Judah. We've got someone else called Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Babylon was the superpower at the time. Going through the passage, we've also got Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials. We meet these four men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And right down the end of the passage, we meet King Cyrus. Now, you might be able to find some information about some of these people from history, documents outside the New Testament, and that's good to read and discover. Sometimes you won't find much at all. So Ashpenaz, this particular official, doesn't appear elsewhere in the Bible. I don't think there's any information about him at all, but it's worth searching. These characters, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Daniel's mentioned a couple of other times in our Bibles, but the main information we have about these four men is, of course, from this book. What about these various kings, like Jehoiakim, king of Judah? Well, he was not a very good king. You can read about him in Kings and Chronicles. If you want to get a feel for the kind of guy he is, why don't have a look at Jeremiah chapter 36, and you'll see what he's like. In Jeremiah 36, the prophet Jeremiah brings the words of God to Jehoiakim written on a scroll. And the king sits there and listens, and every time a few paragraphs is written, he cuts it off and throws it into the fire. And then keeps listening, throws it into the fire. So he takes the very words of God and just burns them up. He's not a good king, and he has no time for God's prophets or God's words. This sinful rebellion in the king mirrors a sinful rebellion in the people as a whole. And that's why Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. You could read, he appears a number of times in our Bibles, but if you went to 2 Chronicles 36, last chapter of Chronicles, and if you particularly looked at verses 5 to 8, you can read about this very moment when Jehoiakim kind of rebels against the superpower of the time, Nebuchadnezzar, And Nebuchadnezzar comes. He carries people off, including Daniel and his 3 friends, off into exile. So these are real characters, real human history. And lastly, we've got down here King Cyrus. He appears in the very same chapter, 2 Chronicles, chapter 36 again, this time in the verses 22 and 23, the very final verses in that book. What you read there is that God causes King Cyrus, king of Persia, to stop the exile. He allows God's people to go back home, to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. And there's almost 70 years between the beginning of the exile with Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim to the end of the exile with King Cyrus. Now, how does any of this obvious stuff help us read the passage? Well, I said that it might help us with some of the whys, right? Why? Why did this happen? Why did God send his people off to exile under a superpower that doesn't even acknowledge him? Well, it's not just because Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon are more powerful. We read in verse 2, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Why did the Lord do that? Because Jehoiakim and the people as a whole were rebelling against him, despite the prophet's warnings again and again and again. It also helps us with one other thing. It's interesting that we're told Daniel remained in the court until the first year of King Cyrus. That could just be a nice historical note, I guess. But once we've done some of the reading and looked at these facts, we see that Daniel is the prophet who lasts the entire exile. He was there at the beginning with Nebuchadnezzar. He's still in the court at the end. When Nebuchadnezzar is long gone, Daniel's still there when Cyrus comes to the throne and he sends the people home after nearly 70 years. The point, I guess, is that Daniel is the prophet of the exile, spanning the entire length. And the point is that Daniel outlasts these pagan kings who took him and his people into exile. It's a note of hope that these kings come and these kings go, but because of God's grace to Daniel, he's still there. He outlasts the bunch of them across the whole of the exile, and that's hugely encouraging. There might be other things that you noticed going through the passage. There's always more than I can pick up in a video. I think the other really interesting thing to do would be to go for the vibe of Daniel chapter 1. Right? The vibe is about imagining the situation being described. Try to feel the problems being addressed. Identify with the people being involved. Try and think about Daniel and his friends and the other young people taken away. What would that have been like? Probably just as teenagers. They knew the sin of their nation. They knew it was just what God was doing. And yet for them, it's like their whole life's over. They're now being carted off to a foreign land to who knows what. It'd be interesting to explore some of the vibe. But that's enough for today. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week for Daniel chapter 2 in Mark the Text.